If you're a football fan, you either love Tom Brady or you hate Tom Brady. There's nobody that's really neutral about him. If you're from New England, you think he's the greatest thing that's ever lived. If you're from anywhere else, you cannot wait for him to retire. The problem is that it doesn't seem like he's ever going to retire. He's going to turn 40 in August, and he's faster and stronger than he was when he came in the league 15 years ago, 17 years ago. The reason for that is has to do with actually our study here. You may not know this, but he's on the Daniel diet. We talked about the Daniel diet a few weeks ago, where Daniel and his buddies only ate vegetables. One of the reasons that he stays healthy is that he's on this strict vegetarian diet. In fact, he's so strict about it that he was at a party with a whole bunch of athletes and football players, and it was off-season, months and months before the season was going to start. And somebody offered him an adult beverage, and he turned it down. He kind of politely declined, and they said, well, why not? It's not football season. You know, you can enjoy it. And he said, I'm in training. Because it turns out he's in training 52 weeks a year. And that's one of the reasons why his opponents are so discouraged that he just doesn't seem to be slowing down any. He's going to retire soon. So his plan is to play into his 80s at this point. We'll see how that goes. What Tom Brady teaches us is how to have a long NFL career, but what we've learned from Daniel in the last few weeks is how to live a lifetime of godliness. Daniel really is a role model for us in so many ways. And today we're going to look at how he's even a role model for senior citizens. When he was a teenager, he trusted God. And now, as we look at chapter 6, when he is probably in his 90s maybe, he's still trusting God. The question is, how did he stay so strong? Because keep in mind, he spent his entire adult life living in a different culture. He was not in Israel, where he was surrounded by the temple and the priest, and people obeyed laws and stuff like this. He spent his entire adult life in Babylon, and then later on ruled by the Persians. But it was a perverse and a twisted culture where he lived. Now, some of you might say, hey, I live in a culture like that right now. Maybe you've spent your entire adult life in a perverse and twisted culture too. The question is, how do you remain strong? You know, there's a song that says, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. And it comes from a biblical idea that we are strangers and aliens in this world. That this world is not our home. We came from God, and we will return to God, and we are on this earth for a short period of time. And we are to live on this earth as strangers and aliens in this place. Not to think that this is a permanent dwelling for us, but this is a temporary stop for us, and we're going to spend eternity with God. That's exactly what Daniel did when he was in Babylon. That's why he was able to stay strong. He never became a Babylonian. Now, they tried to get him to embrace the culture. They gave him a Babylonian name. They fed him a Babylonian diet, or at least they tried to. They tried to get him to worship Babylonian gods, and he simply refused to embrace that culture. Our world puts the same pressure on us today. Whether you're aware of it or not, there's pressure on you every day to embrace the culture around you, to accept their standards and their beliefs, and to abandon things that you have been raised and taught as a child about Christianity and about the teachings of Scripture, to abandon those things that are no longer socially acceptable today in our society. We are put under the exact same pressure that Daniel was put under. And that's why he's such a great role model to us, because for 75 years he was able to resist that pressure and remain true to God. He never accepted his new identity. 75 years after he had been there, when people referred to him, they said, you know, there's that guy who can interpret dreams. They referred to him as Daniel, the exile from Judah. You know, he'd been there 75 years, but he was still the exile from Judah. We lived in New England for a while, and people that we talked to from Maine and Vermont and some of these places, they told me that these are families that lived there for generations and generations and generations. They said if you move up to Vermont, for example, you will be known as, this is Tom, he's from somewhere else. And if you live there for 75 years, you will still be always, that's Tom from somewhere else. You're not from here. Well, that's how Daniel was in Babylon. He was never the Babylonian. He was always the exile from Judah because he refused to embrace their culture. He rejected their food, their religion, and he had a spiritual discipline of praying 3 times a day. Now, I'm not going to ask you and put you on the spot and ask you if you do that, but he had a spiritual discipline that stayed with him from the time he was 15 years old to the time he was 90 years old and maybe longer. But in chapter 1, there's a little hint about Daniel. We read this a few weeks ago when it said Daniel purposed in his heart. That's where it all started with Daniel. When he was taken from his homeland and taken into this new, strange, and alien land, he purposed in his heart to be true to God. And he was faithful to that for the rest of his life. He began training to be a man of God. And he never stopped training. He was in training 52 weeks a year. I'm going to give you, before we start reading from Daniel chapter 6, let me give you a quick outline of the book of Daniel. It's very quick. The book of Daniel is divided in half, and we are finishing up the first half today. The first 6 chapters of the Daniel are his autobiography. It starts off when he's 15, and it takes you up to where he's 90. And there's a lesson in every one of these chapters. There was a lesson that God gave to his people who were exiles, who were strangers living in as aliens in another country. And I want you to I want to review those real quickly with you because I believe that every one of these lessons is pertinent to you right now, living in this strange culture that surrounds us right here. So chapter 1, Daniel and his friends refused to eat the Babylonian diet. They ate that vegetarian diet, and God gave them great strength and built them up. And the message that God gave to his people is, I will sustain you. That was chapter 1. God says, I will sustain you. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had that dream about the statue with all the different layers, gold at the top and clay and iron at the bottom. And it was a prophecy of the things that were to come. But in a dream, a rock came out and destroyed the entire statue. And the message that God was giving to his people is, I will rescue you. And he did a few years later. But that was the message of the dream. I will rescue you. In chapter 3, they threw the 3 young men into the fiery furnace, and they saw a 4th person there who said he looked like a son of God who was in there with them. And he brought them out perfectly protected from the flames. And the message on chapter 3 of God that God gave to his people in exile is, I am right here with you. He was in the furnace with them, and God saying to his people, I am with you as you go through the trials of life. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, because of his pride, was reduced to an animal, and he was eating grass in the field and out there with the cattle and all these sort of things. But he finally was restored, and when he was restored, he turned to God and declared that God was the God of gods. He had like a conversion experience. And the message that God gave to his people was, I restore the humble. Even Nebuchadnezzar, who had been so evil and so far from him, once he humbled himself, God restored him. And that's the message today. God tells you, I will restore the humble. Last week we looked at chapter 5, the famous passage of the writing on the wall. And here we have the new young king, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, who is filled with pride, and he is mocking God by using the goblets from the temple in Israel. And he is absolutely destroyed after the writing on the wall. The message comes to him that basically his time has come. And that very night, the Persians invade and kill him. And the message that God gave to his people in chapter 5 was, I remove the proud. In chapter 4, I restore the humble. In chapter 5, I remove the proud. Now chapter 6, we're going to look at Daniel in the lion's den, the most well-known passage in the whole book. And we're going to see a 90-year-old Daniel face his greatest challenge in his entire life. And the message that's going to come through here, that God is going to give to his people, is just 2 words. Trust me. Trust me. So let's read Daniel chapter 6 together and see how this unfolds. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now you might be wondering, what in the world is a satrap? It's not something you find on the golf course. These are like governors. The satraps they help the king so that the king doesn't have to try to govern the whole. It's sort of like our governors today, each one in charge of a state, but they're responsible to the federal government. Darius was a Persian king, and he had defeated Babylon and defeated the Babylonian king, and now he's got all of these governors, satraps, that are 120 of them, and they're responsible to prevent loss, basically, from military revolts, tax evasion, fraud. They're to kind of keep charge of things there. Verse 3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. This is very impressive for a guy who's 90 years old. They're going to put him over the whole kingdom. He was a favorite of the king. He had experience, he had wisdom, he had a sense of history and leadership. Mostly, he had a revelation from God in heaven. He knew things that no human being could know because God revealed them to Daniel. And so where all of the wisest men in the kingdom had failed time after time after time, Daniel had succeeded because God gave him the answers. And so the king recognized that and was going to put him in the place of influence to assist him. Now, in the whole scheme of things, what's really important for you to know is that God placed Daniel in this place of influence because the Jews were about to finally return to Israel. And it would be the king who would end up funding the whole thing and giving the order to set them free and sending all of the goblets and everything back to the temple in Israel, all of that sort of thing. But Daniel was right there with the king to instruct him on what he needed to do to let these Israelites go back to Judah. So that's why Daniel was put in that place, so that there could be this remnant that would return to Israel. One interesting thing about Daniel is that he himself never did return to Israel. Maybe because he was 90, but because he had a place of importance where he was, and God put him there for a reason. And he never did return to Israel. But he made it possible that thousands of others could go back so they could rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls and all these things. By the way, the next section is going to show a time of great jealousy for Daniel, because the king was going to put Daniel in charge of everybody, much like the jealousy we saw with Joseph when he was the favorite son and the other brothers were very jealous. Watch what happens to Daniel in chapter 4. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the laws of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree into writing. You see what they did? They just appealed to his pride. They were saying, you're like a god here. There's no one that's more important than you. You should make it a law that nobody can pray to anybody else other than you. And all of it, of course, they were setting the king up to get to Daniel. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Today we would call that civil disobedience. The government has passed a law, he's disobeying the law because he obeyed God above man. It's Spirit-led boldness, because he hears that anybody who prays is going to be thrown in the lion's den, and the first thing he does is go up in front of an open window and pray. He didn't even draw the curtains. He prayed in front of an open window exactly the way he had prayed before, and he prayed giving thanks to God at that time. You know, people kind of always think it's strange when we look at that passage of Scripture that says, give thanks in all circumstances. And you say, how can I give thanks when I lose my job? How can I give thanks when I'm diagnosed with cancer? How can I give thanks when we have these bad things happen to us? Well, the Bible doesn't say to give thanks for all circumstances, but in all circumstances. Because even in the darkest times, God is with you. And Daniel gives thanks to his God even when this terrible news comes to him. And he is willing, he's counted the cost. He's basically thought about this. He's made this decision. He says, I can either stop praying and preserve my life, or I can continue to pray and obey God, and it could cost me my life. He counted the cost, and he decided that he was going to continue to pray. Even if he had to die for it, he was not going to compromise his convictions and his faith in God. You know, one of the things that has amazed onlookers, people who observe Christians throughout history, is how many Christians have been willing to die for their faith. Back in the 19th century, when missionaries would pack up to go over to Africa, they didn't put their goods and things, their clothes and everything in suitcases. They packed them in coffins and put the coffin on the ship to go over with them because they planned to die over there. That was how committed they were. And Daniel was that way too. He was planning to die, but he would rather die than disobey God. Verse 11, then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, there it is, that's how he's identified. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Verse 14. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. It's quite a statement coming from a pagan king, knowing that he's throwing this man to his death. May your God, whom you serve continually, that's the reputation Daniel had. May he rescue you. You know, the lion's den, we've used that term since we were children. The word den literally comes from a word that means dig. And so the picture that we have of a lion's den, I've always pictured it as kind of a cave, but it's more of a picture of something that is dug out, and there's a hole up above where they can throw the food down to them. And this appears to be the case where they threw Daniel into this pit. And it says in 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. And then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. It shows you the depth of his relationship with Daniel and his respect for Daniel, that he couldn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Then there was a pause. And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. That's how you always talk to a king. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. He says God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. Some people theorize that it was the same one that was in the fiery furnace, that same angel that the king described as an angel, that some people believed was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ himself. But God sent his messenger, and he shut the mouths of the lions. There was, in verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. It's an amazing miracle. It's very similar when we read about the fiery furnace. When those 3 young men came out of the furnace, not only did it said not a hair on their heads was singed, but they didn't even smell like smoke. Remember that? Here he comes out, and there's not a wound on him. There's not a scratch on him. Even from when they dropped him in there, you think he might have skinned a knee or something, but there's not a scratch on him. Now, sometimes God saves people from certain death, and we rejoice when we read these stories. But I think it's important for us to know that sometimes people are martyred for their faith. Sometimes when Christians are sentenced to death for their faith, they die. God doesn't save every person who is sentenced to death for their faith. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, when Hebrews talks about the fiery furnace and the lion's den, I don't think I have the text in front of you, but it's in Hebrews chapter 11, and I just want to read to you what it says about these heroes of the faith. The writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11, verse 32, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what is promised, and listen to this, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again, and this is what is important to read. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released that they might gain even a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes and in grounds. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." So what the writer of Hebrews has said is that some of the great heroes of the faith, like Daniel, were rescued from certain death when they were sentenced to death. But some of the great heroes of the faith died when they were sentenced to death. That same thing happens today. We have had Christians who have been arrested for their faith over in Iraq and Afghanistan, other places, and we pray desperately that they'll be released, and sometimes they're released and they come back to their families and we rejoice. Sometimes they are beheaded for their faith. So when we read this, we praise God that He can save a person from certain death. But we also know that it's not always God's plan, and that we trust God no matter what plan He has. We trust that His plan is always right and always the best. And what Hebrews ends with is saying that both of these groups, the ones who died and the ones who were saved, both of them have heaven to look forward to, something better, that we will join them in that as well. So the same is true for all of you. When you pray for God to have these miraculous things happen in your life, sometimes God heals miraculously, and sometimes people die from the disease. It doesn't mean that the one person was sinful and the other person was perfect. It just means that God's plan is different for each person. But God's plan is always perfect. As we go back to the story, we learn about what some people call instant karma. It's popular on YouTube these days, where somebody does something bad and they immediately get hit back. In verse 24, at the king's command, The men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. It's pretty brutal. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Whew, it's tough to read that. It's immediate judgment on the enemies of Daniel. They were immediately judged and punished for what they did. One of the lessons there is that you do not oppose God or God's people. It's not going to end well for you. And it also silenced any critics who said, well, maybe those lions weren't hungry. Maybe they were old lions that didn't have any teeth anymore. Maybe that's why they didn't attack Daniel. Well, when you see what happened with the same exact lions with these other people, you realize that wasn't the case. And verse 25 says, Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and the people of every language on earth, and listen to what he wrote. This is the king of Persia writing this. May you prosper greatly. He's writing this to the entire world, by the way. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Some message coming from a pagan king, isn't it? Much like Nebuchadnezzar, he seems to have had a conversion experience because he witnessed the faith of Daniel and the power of God. And the chapter ends by verse 28. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You know, the conversion experience that happened to Darius is not an accident. It's because Daniel was faithful in his discipline with the Lord in praying 3 times a day. It's because the king had watched Daniel and had seen him be faithful for years, daily to God. And then he saw him be willing to die rather than compromise, and he saw the power of God. When the world watches you, they are watching to see if you compromise. That's what they want to know. Is this Christianity real? Are you serious about your faith? Or is this just one of many things in your life? And if they see you be faithful to God, even when times are very difficult, if they see you refusing to compromise your faith in your actions, they will be changed. That's the loudest message that we can send to the world, is to live our faith on a daily basis and live it publicly, where we don't close the curtain so nobody will see, but publicly we live our faith so that others can see it. In fact, Daniel's prayer, his faithful prayer, was the most evident sign of his faith. You can't see a person's faith. But when you get down on your knees in front of an open window 3 times a day, they see his prayer. And prayer is a great sign of faith. Daniel's prayer was public. He didn't try to hide it. Daniel's prayer was persistent in the fact that he prayed every single day. And he prayed 3 times a day, and he never varied that no matter what happened. In his old age, from the time he was 15 to the time he was 90, he prayed in times of crisis, and he also prayed when there was no crisis whatsoever. A lot of Christians, I find, pray vehemently when they get in trouble. But when things are going good, they can kind of skip some of the times of prayer. Churches, after 9/11 a few years ago, the churches were packed all around the country. And then as the threats of terrorism kind of got lower and lower, the churches began to empty out again. Christians, for some reason, cling to God during a crisis, but can forget about God when things are going well. That's what Moses said when the people went into the promised land. When you go into this land of milk and honey, you're going to be richer than you've ever been before. And watch out, be careful because at that time, when things are going good for you, you will forget God. Daniel didn't forget God when things were good. He was diligent in his prayers. And he also prayed in times of crisis. And his prayer always included thanksgiving. No matter what the circumstances, his prayer always included thanksgiving. So prayer is your indicator of your trust. If you want to ask yourself, how much do I trust God? Just look at your life over the past week and say, how many times did I pray? How often do I pray? How committed am I to prayer? Is prayer directly proportional to your trust? A young pastor, I'm almost sure it was Charles Stanley, told a story about a time in his early ministry when things were going very badly for him. And when you see his success later in life, it's hard to imagine. But as a young man, he had a lot of critics in the church, people who didn't like the way he taught or preached or whatever, and people were attacking him, and he kind of felt like they were the lions and he was the Daniel, and he was being attacked in his church. And there was an elderly lady in the church who invited him over for lunch to try to encourage this young preacher. And she had a picture on her wall. I think we have a copy of it in the PowerPoint. Do you have it? There it is. This is the picture she had on her wall. And she took him over to the picture and she says, "Do you know what that is?" And he says, "That looks like a picture of Daniel in the lion's den." And she said, "That's exactly what it is." And she said, "Do you notice anything about that picture?" And he's looking at it, trying to figure out what she means. And she said, "Do you notice where Daniel's eyes are? Daniel's not looking at the lions. Daniel keeps his eyes on the Lord." She said to him, as this young preacher, she said, "Keep your eyes on the Lord. Forget about the lions. God will take care of the lions. You keep your eyes on the Lord." And that advice got him through that rough time early in his ministry, and he went on to have great ministry for the Lord. I want to say the same thing to you. You may have some lions nipping at your heels, or maybe they're just full out going for your jugular right now. And if not, the lions will come. There will be critics. There will be those who will try to destroy you. But keep your eyes on the Lord. He'll take care of the lions. Let's pray together.